The morning of December 17, 1944, changed everything. Not through some brilliant tactical maneuver or heroic last stand, but through 50,000 gallons of abandoned gasoline and the terrible mathematics they revealed. SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper stood among pyramids of American fuel cans in the frozen Belgian dawn, jerry cans stacked 3 meters high, stretching 200 meters into the mist. His men, exhausted from 20 hours of combat, fell upon them like wolves on a carcass. They pried open the cans, sniffed the contents, and shouted with joy. High-octane gasoline, enough to save the entire offensive, enough to reach the Meuse River, enough to change history. Peiper should have been celebrating. Instead, as he watched his Panthers and Tigers drinking American fuel, a different realization crept through him like the morning cold. If the Americans could abandon this much, if they could leave behind what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then what exactly were they fighting? The answer would destroy more than tanks. It would shatter the last illusions of the Third Reich. Just 6 months earlier, when Allied bombers first started systematically destroying Germany's synthetic fuel plants, the Wehrmacht had dismissed it as temporary harassment. The great hydrogenation works at Leuna, Pölitz, and Brux had seemed invincible, their massive concrete structures and redundant systems built to withstand anything. By September, Leuna's production had fallen from 175,000 tons to 5,000. The other plants were operating at less than 10% capacity. Germany's mechanized armies were being strangled drop by drop. The numbers were so catastrophic that when Albert Speer presented them to Hitler, the Führer accused his own armaments minister of defeatism. Germany was producing 33 million barrels of oil annually, including every drop from synthetic plants and captured Romanian fields. The United States alone was producing 1.8 billion barrels, not million, billion. The Americans were literally producing more oil in a week than Germany could manage in a year. Yet, Hitler ordered Operation Watch on the Rhine anyway. The last great German offensive. 3 armies, 250,000 men, would smash through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, and recapture Antwerp. It would split the Western Allies, force them to negotiate, and buy Germany time to deploy its wonder weapons. There was just one problem. The entire offensive required 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million. Only 2.5 million were actually delivered. The German High Command solution revealed everything. They would capture American fuel along the way. The most powerful military machine in German history was reduced to planning its operations around stealing enemy gasoline. 2 days before the offensive, Peiper attended his final briefing. General Sepp Dietrich didn't mince words. "You will have fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies." The mathematics were simple and damning. Peiper had 31,000 gallons for his entire Kampfgruppe. The distance to the Meuse was 65 miles through difficult terrain. His Tigers burned 2.5 gallons per mile in combat. His Panthers burned 1.5. In the frozen, hilly Ardennes, consumption would increase by 40%. The fuel would run out at mile 50. The plan required him to find American gasoline or die trying. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the German barrage began. More artillery ammunition was fired in 2 hours than entire operations had used earlier in the war. The sound was overwhelming, apocalyptic, magnificent. But even as American positions crumbled under the bombardment, even as the great offensive lurched forward, every German commander knew they were racing against empty fuel gauges. Peiper's column started moving at 7. Within hours, the first crisis hit. The roads marked as highways on German maps were narrow Belgian country lanes, many unpaved, all clogged with snow. Vehicles designed for the Russian steppes struggled through forest paths. Engines idled in massive traffic jams, burning precious fuel while going nowhere. At Lanzerath, 18 Americans from an intelligence platoon held up Peiper's entire column for 10 hours. 18 men against the most powerful armored spearhead Germany had assembled. While German tanks sat motionless, engines running, burning fuel they couldn't spare, those 18 Americans didn't know they were winning a battle of mathematics. Every hour of delay meant hundreds of gallons burned, gallons that couldn't be replaced. When Peiper finally broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn on December 17th, his column had covered 20 miles and consumed 40% of its fuel. At this rate, they'd run dry before reaching the halfway point. Then they found the depot. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, who could read English from his pre-war work, found shipping manifests in the depot office. He brought them to Peiper, his hands shaking, not from cold, but from what he'd read. This fuel had traveled from Texas oil fields to New York refineries, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, then been trucked 400 miles to this Belgian crossroads, 6,000 miles in 6 weeks. The journey of a single gallon told the entire story of the war. But it was another discovery that truly shattered German illusions. Private Ernst Keller found American newspapers, dated just 2 days old, celebrating the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, 300,000 gallons per day through a single pipe, more fuel flowing daily through one pipeline than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe would use in the whole offensive. As his men frantically filled their tanks with American gasoline, Peiper made quick calculations. They'd captured 50,000 gallons. It seemed like salvation. It seemed like a miracle. Then he looked at the scale of the depot, at the casual way Americans had abandoned it, at the newspapers talking about millions of gallons, and understood they'd already lost. The American fuel was too good for German engines, 80 octane and higher, designed for American engines built to higher tolerances. The temperamental Maybach engines in the Tiger tanks were designed for 74 octane fuel. Several vehicles began running rough almost immediately, their engines knocking from the superior gasoline they weren't built to handle. Even in victory, even in capturing enemy supplies, Germany was revealing its inferiority. Peiper pushed forward with his rejuvenated column, reaching Stavelot by evening. Here was the prize: a major American fuel depot containing over 2 million gallons, enough to guarantee reaching the Meuse, enough to make the impossible possible. But as the first German vehicles approached, Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was already at work. The Stavelot depot sprawled across 15 acres. Jerry cans stacked in pyramids that seemed to touch the sky, 289,000 gallons of gasoline. Brewster's orders were simple and absolute: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. At 4:30 p.m., as Peiper's advance guard came into view, Brewster gave the order. Engineers poured gasoline trails between the stacks. White phosphorus grenades were distributed. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis threw the first grenade and watched his world explode. The fire shot up perhaps 100 feet, then spread like a living thing, consuming everything. Within minutes, the entire depot was an inferno that would burn for 3 days. Peiper arrived to find a pillar of black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the sky. The heat was so intense, his men couldn't approach within 200 meters. They could only stand and watch 2 million gallons burn. Unteroffizier Weber, Peiper's driver, later testified about that moment. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his tank turret watching the flames. He said nothing for 5 minutes. Then he climbed down and said, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here?" The burning of Stavelot was just the beginning. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were destroying fuel dumps rather than risk their capture. At Francorchamps, 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. La Glaise, another million. In the first week alone, Americans deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel, more than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive. More than many German units had seen in years. The American capacity for destruction revealed a truth more devastating than any defeat. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for 1st Army, recorded on December 18th a routine supply report. Fuel received, 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel consumed, 1,823,000 gallons. Net gain to reserves, 224,000 gallons. While Peiper scraped for every liter, while German tanks were being abandoned for lack of fuel, the Americans were building reserves during combat operations, during their greatest crisis. The mathematics of American abundance operated on a scale Germans literally couldn't comprehend. The Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy system supplying the front, burned more fuel in its own operations than entire German divisions received monthly. 6,000 trucks operating around the clock, each consuming 40 gallons daily just to deliver supplies. The delivery system alone consumed more fuel than German Army Group B's monthly allocation. By December 19th, as Peiper's forces engaged American defenders at Stoumont, the crisis had become terminal. Tigers were being abandoned not from battle damage, but from empty fuel tanks. Peiper consolidated his remaining fuel, perhaps 8,000 gallons. Enough for one last engagement or a retreat, but not both. He radioed for reinforcement, for resupply, for salvation. The response came back. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. Available resources. 8,000 gallons for a Kampfgruppe that had started with some of Germany's finest troops and most powerful tanks. Meanwhile, that same day, American C-47s flew 316 sorties, delivering supplies to surrounded Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. The Americans were flying more fuel to a surrounded garrison in one day than Peiper's entire force now possessed. The news spread through German ranks like poison. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife, "The Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly. They drive tanks like we march on foot. This war is lost." He wasn't alone. Captured German soldiers expressed more shock at American waste than at American firepower. Seeing GIs discard half-eaten rations, use gasoline to heat coffee, or leave vehicle engines running for warmth did more damage to morale than 1,000 artillery shells. On December 20th, Peiper called his commanders together. Sturmbannführer Werner Pochke was brutally direct. "We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 kilometers away." According to testimony from Hans Gruller, Peiper's adjutant, the commander's response revealed everything. "Gentlemen, we have discovered we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. What we captured at Hohnsfeld, which seemed miraculous, was nothing to them. We cannot win this." The realization wasn't limited to Peiper. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "When I learned the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk our capturing it, I knew the offensive had failed before it began. You cannot fight such abundance with courage alone." Colonel Friedrich von der Heydte, captured December 23rd, told his interrogators with bitter clarity, "Your soldiers throw away more chocolate than my men have seen in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons while we measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" On the night of December 23rd, Peiper abandoned his vehicles and escaped on foot through American lines. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that began the offensive, 39 remained operational but immobile. These were destroyed with their last ammunition rather than leave them for the Americans. Millions of Reichsmarks of Germany's most sophisticated weapons destroyed not by enemy fire but by empty fuel tanks. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Goltz described the final moments. "We drained the last fuel from all vehicles, maybe 200 liters total. The Obersturmbannführer personally destroyed his command tank. As I watched him place the charges, I realized we weren't just destroying vehicles. We were destroying the myth that willpower could overcome material reality." Of 5,000 men who began with Kampfgruppe Peiper, approximately 770 returned. They had advanced 60 miles, captured several depots, killed hundreds of Americans, including the infamous massacre at Malmedy. But most importantly, they had discovered the truth about American logistics and, through it, the truth about the war itself. The psychological impact rippled through the Wehrmacht faster than any retreat. When Peiper reported to Field Marshal Model on December 26th, he presented the captured American supply manifests. Model's chief of staff recorded his reaction. The Field Marshal read the quantities twice: 50,000 gallons at Hohnsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed rather than captured. He put down the papers and said simply, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler, informed on December 28th, refused to accept reality. Speer wrote in his diary, The Führer insisted the numbers were propaganda. When shown photographs of the burning Stavelot depot, he claimed they were Hollywood special effects. But the lower ranks understood what the high command would not admit. The truth was encoded in production statistics that told everything. In 1944, America produced 50% of the world's total manufacturing output. A new aircraft every 5 minutes, a Liberty ship every day, a tank every 7 minutes. Against this, Germany could offer only courage, experience, and superior tactics. None of it mattered when you ran out of fuel 50 miles from your objective. The numbers told a story of impossibility. United States oil production, 1.8 billion barrels. Soviet Union, 110 million barrels. Germany, including every drop of synthetic fuel, 33 million barrels. Japan, 2.6 million barrels. The entire Axis combined produced less than 2% of American petroleum. Every major German offensive after 1942 had been constrained by fuel. Every American offensive was supported by abundance German planners couldn't even conceive. By late 1944, the infrastructure gap had become absurd. The Americans had built a pipeline across France. Operation Pluto had laid fuel lines across the English Channel itself, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain. The network of pipelines extended inland like arteries. The Cherbourg-Paris line delivered 800,000 gallons daily. The Seine line moved 650,000 gallons. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons daily while receiving 8.2 million gallons. They were building reserves while fighting. Against this, Germany offered heroes without fuel. The Luftwaffe had grounded most of its aircraft. Pilot training had been cut from 250 flight hours to 60. The surface fleet had ceased operations. U-boats were fitted with snorkels to conserve diesel by running on batteries longer. On the home front, German civilians hadn't seen private automobile traffic since 1942. Farmers were returning to horse-drawn plows, while American soldiers washed their clothes in gasoline. The Ardennes offensive consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons total, 40% from captured supplies. During the same period, the Americans consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. But most devastating was the loss of illusions. Every German who witnessed American abundance understood Germany wasn't fighting a war, but participating in its own execution. General Heinz Guderian, reviewing the offensive's failure, wrote with uncommon clarity, "When Peiper captured 50,000 gallons that meant everything to him, but nothing to the Americans, the war's outcome was revealed. We were fighting with scarcity against abundance, measuring our fuel by the gallon while they measured theirs by the million." During the Nuremberg trials, German military leaders consistently cited logistics, particularly fuel, as the decisive factor. Field Marshal Keitel testified, "We had operational superiority from 1940 to 1941. By 1944, we couldn't move our forces for lack of fuel, while the Americans moved entire armies like chess pieces." The soldier's courage means nothing if his tank has an empty fuel gauge. Even Peiper, tried for the Malmedy massacre, offered revealing testimony. Every decision after December 17th was influenced by fuel shortage. We couldn't maneuver, couldn't pursue, couldn't retreat effectively. The Americans moved freely while we counted every leader. We shot prisoners because we didn't have fuel to transport them. Even our war crimes were shaped by petroleum poverty. The lesson extended far beyond World War II. The Ardennes revealed that industrial warfare would be won in refineries and factories, not on battlefields. Production statistics would matter more than tactical brilliance. The German soldier of 1944 was arguably better trained, more experienced, and more desperate. None of it mattered. The Americans were backed by an industrial machine that could waste more than Germany could produce. Colonel Trevor Dupuy calculated that by December 1944, each American soldier was supported by 67 pounds of supplies daily. Each German received 3 pounds. The Americans complained about waste and inefficiency. The Germans would have considered American waste an unimaginable abundance. By spring 1945, the fuel crisis had reduced the Wehrmacht to immobility. Entire panzer divisions sat helplessly as Allied forces drove past them. General der Panzertruppe Fritz Bayerlein described scenes of surreal impotence. We had 42 operational tanks, experienced crews, plenty of ammunition. We had 300 liters of fuel total, not enough to reach the next town. We destroyed our own tanks and walked into captivity. The ultimate humiliation for a panzer commander, destroyed not by the enemy, but by empty fuel gauges. Meanwhile, the American advance was constrained only by traffic jams from their own vehicle abundance. Third Army alone operated 15,000 vehicles. The Ninth Army had so many trucks, they created multi-lane highways through German territory. They had so much fuel that supply officers complained about storage problems, not shortages. In 1967, more than 20 years after the war, Jochen Peiper gave an interview to historian Henry Lehmann. By then, the SS officer had served his prison sentence and was living quietly in France, working as a translator. 9 years later, he would be murdered by unknown assailants, his past finally catching up with him. But in that interview, he offered a reflection that captured everything. Finding that depot at Hansfeld was the worst thing that could have happened. If we had run out of fuel earlier, we might have retreated with our illusions intact, believing we lost to bad luck or temporary shortage. Instead, we discovered the Americans had oceans of fuel while we had drops. We discovered we were fighting against impossibility itself. The depot didn't save us. It showed us we were already dead. The final irony came in the American after-action reports. Major Robert Harrison's salvage team, cataloging abandoned German equipment at L'Église, found 39 perfect tanks, abandoned solely for lack of fuel. His report noted with bureaucratic indifference, fuel required to recover vehicles, 8,000 gallons. Classification, routine. Source, local reserves. Estimated time, 4 hours. What was impossible for the Germans, 8,000 gallons to save their best tanks, was beneath American notice. A routine request using local reserves that exceeded Kampfgruppe Peiper's strength at its peak. This was what Peiper had discovered that frozen morning at Hansfeld. Not just that America had more fuel, but that American abundance operated on a scale that made German scarcity irrelevant. They weren't fighting the same war. They weren't even living in the same universe. In 1984, 40 years after the battle, veterans from both sides gathered at L'Église for a reunion. The museum there displays one of Peiper's Tiger tanks, still positioned where it ran out of fuel on December 23, 1944. Former Stabsgefreiter Karl Wortmann stood beside the tank with former Staff Sergeant Ray Anderson of the 30th Infantry Division. "We always wondered why you stopped," Anderson said. "We thought it was some brilliant tactical maneuver. We spent days trying to figure out your strategy." Wortmann laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We stopped because the tanks were empty. You burned millions of gallons to keep them from us. How could we fight that?" Anderson was quiet for a long moment, then said something that summarized the entire war. "We never knew you were that short on fuel. We had so much, we never even thought about it." One side measured fuel by the gallon, the other by the million. One side fought desperately for each jerry can, while the other burned oceans of gasoline as a tactical inconvenience. The outcome wasn't determined by courage or skill or tactical brilliance. It was determined by petroleum geology, refinery capacity, and industrial mathematics that had declared Germany's defeat before the first shot was fired. Today, that Tiger tank still sits in L'Église, its fuel gauge forever frozen on empty. Visitors often ask why such powerful, sophisticated machines were simply abandoned. The guide gives them a one-word answer that explains not just the Battle of the Bulge, not just the German defeat, but the entire logic of industrial warfare. Benzene. Gasoline. The thing the Americans had so much of, they could burn millions of gallons just to keep it from enemy hands. The thing the Germans had so little of that, finding 50,000 gallons felt like salvation until they learned it was nothing. The thing that revealed, on a frozen Belgian morning, that the Third Reich wasn't fighting a war anymore. It was simply running on empty, measuring its doom 1 gallon at a time, while its enemies measured victory in oceans. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.